Hello, my name is Glenn Arnold, and today I'm going to be talking about marriage between Aztecs in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Before I begin, a quick overview of the topics related to Aztec marriage that I will be covering. First, why get married at all? Gender expectations before marriage, the role of family in marriage, matchmakers, courtship steps on the path to marriage, ceremonial aspects, gender expectations for a married unit, the nobility, some key conclusions, and a bibliography to round things off. So to start us off, why bother getting married at all? Marriage was so central to Aztec society that if a youth did not marry after having passed the age for marriage, he was dismissed from the house. Males had the initiative to choosing to begin the process because the female would join his kaupuli, his family household, and it was at the sufferance of his parents that he might be considered an adult. Women, on the other hand, were only permitted to leave the temple to marry if the fathers, the mothers, the men of the neighborhood, and the noblemen all consented. The Aztecs were a very divided society based on gender, and as such there were several gender expectations to be met before marriage. Boys and girls were put to school in separate institutions, and they were also generally kept apart from one another. Both were expected to be chaste for their weddings, but boys had more leeway. They were allowed to be a bit more experienced with the opposite sex. Boys were also raised to be warriors and civil servants of all kinds at these different institutions. Girls, on the other hand, were raised to be weavers, market-goers, cooks, and otherwise run the household from an economic standpoint. Both spheres were seen as separate but equal within Aztec society, and gender was no impediment to success. Young men were warned against premature sexual contact, however, in case they ceased to give forth liquid. A man who ruined himself impetuously would find himself unable to satisfy his spouse until she longeth for the carnal relations which thou owest thy spouse, and looked elsewhere. Young women were certainly warned against acting upon their sexual desires, but young men were regarded as equally susceptible to temptation, and even in some senses more culpable than their female peers. Upon the occasion of his marriage, a young man held a banquet for his peers at the Topochcali, his school, at which he offered gifts and explained his wish to retire from his duties at school because of his marriage. So given the gender divide within Aztec society and the segregation that resulted, one might question how a couple would meet in the first place. While both genders had their own segregated schools, the schools were located near each other. Obviously, this is because of geography. They might also belong to the same Cuicacali, or house of song, where they were schooled in the Aztec faith and took lessons in dance and music together, both of which were extremely important to Aztec society. This was, of course, then the most common place for young people to interact. Couples might also belong to the same kaupuli or land segment. While they wouldn't be necessarily siblings, they would be perhaps cousins or other more distant relations. The role of family in the marriage of a young Aztec couple was substantial. Family consent was fundamental, but they took into account the feelings of both sides of the young couple. Underlining the Aztec belief in status by merit, a young man could strengthen his case for marriage by performing a notable feat of courage or skill either on the battlefield or in his school. Manhood and maturity were directly tied to accomplishment, and it seems likely that a girl's family would have looked much more favorably on a proposal from a promising young husband. Family would discuss which women to request for their son, based on her own merits in her areas of responsibility. The mothers of the bride and groom were given the responsibility of conveying to their children-in-law the expectations of their new roles within the households. Perhaps even more important than the role of family, however, was the role of matchmakers. Matchmakers were typically older women who were respected in the community. Matches were typically decided by the two who wished to be married, but there were other considerations as well, as outlined earlier. Matchmakers evaluated both halves of the pairing and acted as a sort of impartial judge. They were the key player in the ritual joining of the couple as well, with a role similar to an officiant, which we will get into further on in the slideshow. Now I will outline the steps along the path to marriage. At the beginning, the family and the teachers of the boy would decide when the boy was ready for marriage. Once that was the case, they would move on to step 2, wherein the family would then discuss which girls could make good potential wives for their son. After that, they would meet with a matchmaker who would facilitate the marriage. The matchmaker would then consult with the calendar priests to make sure that both were born on good days for each other and that the marriage could be put together on a good day for both people. Number 5, the matchmaker would ask for permission of the girl's parents for her to be married. This often involved negotiations like, we'll sell you some turkeys over here, or perhaps a land exchange would be involved, capes would be exchanged, that sort of thing. The calendar priests would then, of course, decide on the best day for a ceremony between both parties, and then both parties would spend the next few weeks preparing for the marriage. Once preparations were complete, and it was almost time to begin the ceremonies, people were invited over on the day before the ceremony. The bride would get ready for the ceremony in her own home with the help of her family and the matchmaker. And once it was dark outside, the bride would be led to the groom's home. The ceremony would begin there. After the ceremony, the couple would be led to a bedchamber by the matchmaker, where they would stay in isolation together for 4 days and begin the process of becoming man and wife. And after 4 days, another feast was held to celebrate the consummation of the marriage. At this point, the marriage would be complete, and the new couple would be ready to face the world as adults. The ceremonies themselves were full of a rich symbolism. Food was very important, as when the new wife was admitted to the family, she was fed 4 mouthfuls by the groom's mother, which symbolizes her joining the family. In turn, the bride did the same for her new husband, feeding him 4 mouthfuls of food, symbolizing her new role as a domestic provider to him. Turkey, chocolate, and tamales all had a ritual significance. Another important ceremonial aspect of the Aztec ceremony were capes. On the occasion of marriage, it was customary for a husband to give his new wife 5 cotton capes. These capes enabled the wife to enter the cycle of exchange and begin her role as a household provider. The Aztecs had no formal currency, but capes, made of cotton, cacao beans, and axes, were among the most prominent articles of exchange and tribute and barter in the Aztec marketplace. These allowed her to exchange a form of wealth for food or household staples, which would allow the family to begin its economic life. One of the most important ceremonial aspects of Aztec marriage was the literal tying of a knot between the husband and the wife. They were bonded together by the fabrics that they wore, generally a cape, and this knot was tied by the matchmaker, who facilitated and made this key symbol of the couple's bond. Most important, however, and I'm sure all married couples can agree, was consummation. Here the woman was explicitly embraced by her future husband's kin. She became their daughter in their eyes. The woman's transition to the role of wife and mother would be complete. With her change of status, she was expected to fulfill new responsibilities, and there was no longer a place for her in her parents' household. Following the fastening ceremony, which tied them together for life, i.e. the knot, the couple were taken to a chamber guarded by the matchmakers to do penance and fast for 4 days before cohabiting. obviously, that involved other things, not just necessarily being penitent towards the gods or being pious. But officially, that's what they were there to do. As I've said before, the 4 days of seclusion were a time to establish familiarity, consideration, and compassion between a couple, possibly barely acquainted before their wedding, but realistically they knew each other fairly well. This is a vital element of the ritual, the time for compassion and intimacy during the more impersonal and communal ceremony, which has happened to this point. But at this point, the couple would be initiated into their life as a married couple, including being introduced to intimacy. At the end of this period of seclusion, the fresh straw mat which they had used was shaken out in the courtyard and then laid where they were to sleep in their new connubial home. Their liminal period was concluded, and they were prepared to emerge fully adult into the world. And at this point, they entered a world of new expectations as a married unit. The most important reason for marriage at any level of Aztec society was reproduction and raising the next generation of children. As the gods before them did, they too would do for the gods. Marriage was central to a man's self-perception. As a husband, he assumed a different nature, changed not only socially and superficially, but also physically and intrinsically. It was a true spiritual transformation. His fate lay in exhausting his force, i.e. his energies, to support his household and city. For him, the future was suffering, exhaustion, and struggle. As kids might say before they're getting married today, it's game over. For a wife, the hardships of life were bestowed by the gods. They were to be borne with diligent and solitary acceptance. A woman assiduously scaled a mountain of work every day, absolutely submissive to the will of the gods. As a wife, women's practical obligations were many and demanding. Women in Aztec households were both productive and highly skilled, and the domestic character of female duties did not diminish their value. For men, too, strength and robustness were also emphasized as particular obligations. Physicality and intrepidity brought a strong marriage and worthy children. Fortitude and staunch devoutness were the traits which were advocated for success and prosperity in a martial world, and both men and women brought courage and strength to the marital union. And while women's roles naturally reach far beyond these two arenas, cooking and manufacture of cloth are the areas most closely associated with women in both practical and ideological terms. Despite their destructive potential in their relationship to the earth goddess, women were fundamentally creative in both practical and primal senses. Women were responsible for the production of beautiful and intricate objects, nowhere more so than during childbirth, but also through more practical skills such as textile production and other expert crafts. And from an economic standpoint, of course, they were incredibly important in the marketplace. The Aztec nobility had a different relationship with marriage than the common folk did. Marriage was primarily done for political purposes by the Aztec rulers, especially those in the Triple Alliance of Teotihuacan, Texcoco, and Tlatelolco. These three types of marriage alliances involved primary marriage, which was with one woman who became the head of the ruler's household and was usually from the most valued ally who held a great deal of influence. Secondary marriages were with shared women who were referred to as concubines from cities who formed willing alliances with the Aztec rulers. And tertiary marriages were with women who were gained as part of peace agreements or after a conquest by the Aztec rulers. The reality of relationships was highly complex for the elite, but although legal, polygyny was reserved for a very narrow group of males, and it barely impacted on the philosophy or reality for the Aztec population. But perhaps contrary to what you might expect, female bloodlines were especially prized for political propaganda purposes, especially in the early days of Aztec rule in the Valley of Mexico. When the Chichimec, or barbarian or nomadic Aztec peoples first arrived in the area, authority was derived from proximity to the Toltec bloodlines. This necessitated that the Aztecs had to marry their sons to the daughters of settled princes in order to be recognized as authorities. As the Aztecs gained power, this set the precedent of the offering of daughters as a marker of handing down authority from superior to inferior in the Aztec political hierarchy. It was a sort of legitimization of whichever family intended to marry into the supposedly greater family. Atop the Aztec hierarchy was the city-state of Tenochtitlan, the head of the Triple Alliance of Texcoco, Tlatelolco, and themselves, and Tenochtitlan maintained its primacy over the other two by ensuring that his daughters were married to the heirs of the other two city-states, who in turn did the same thing to subordinate city-states under their protection. However, to ensure a steady supply of heirs, daughters, and familial relations, the Aztec nobility were polygamous, with the status of the women in their households having important effects on political relationships. These women were themselves independent to do as they pleased and respected within the households of the men that they married. They effectively served as spies and diplomats for their male relatives, while jockeying for status under the man that they married, their king. Mistreatment of wives and concubines could be, and often were, a major sticking point in city-state politics. If you take away nothing else from this video, do note that marriage was a crucial coming-of-age ritual for the Aztecs, and was extremely important as it perpetuated the Aztec household into the next generation. Like most marriage rituals, it was modeled on the folklore of its ancient forebears, but as time passed, innovations took place, especially at the level of the nobility, to bring titular symbolism to bear in order for the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan in particular, to dominate neighboring cities politically after conquest. Gender roles in Aztec society were firmly delineated with different roles for both genders. Both were recognized as equals, but separate. Matchmakers provided the essential service of enabling the marriage of couples through their endorsements, negotiations, and arrangements of the weddings themselves. Key aspects of the marriage ritual included a ritual cleansing of the wife and her adoption by the groom's family, tying their capes together as a symbol of their bond, ritually prepared feasts, finally culminating in consummation. Gender roles were largely unchanged after the marriage, but gender was not an obstacle to success in Aztec society, as women could perform any role they wanted except that of a sacrificial priest, which was the sole province of the male. The nobility, especially the kings of the Aztec city-states, practiced a tiered form of polygamy, where status was based on one's designation as a wife, concubine, or a tertiary type that was beneath a concubine. In this role, women served as diplomats in the households of the kings to whom they were bonded. The primary wife, however, had primacy above all others. This was practiced as a way of maintaining alliances, since early Aztec settlers in the Valley of Mexico derived their authority matrilineally through Toltec bloodlines. Thank you so much for listening to that long video. I hope it answered enough of the questions that you'd like answered. Feel free to look at these sources and learn more about the Aztec experience with marriage. Thank you.